this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
In a Biography of America, we've tried to bring to life some of the defining moments of American history using the medium of storytelling. At the root of all history are memories, memories that have been woven into stories. Today, we turn to four storytellers who have drawn on the past to create works of power and truthfulness. Esmeralda Santiago, author of When I Was a Puerto Rican.
Here I am in this, Katona, New York, and I started out in Macon, Puerto Rico. How did that happen?
The Boston Globe called her one of the most powerful new voices in American fiction. Arthur Golden, author of the acclaimed national bestseller, Memoirs of a Geisha.
Things don't always narrow down to a sort of pencil point of truth. It's kind of messy.
Charles Johnson, author of Middle Passage, winner of the National Book Award for fiction.
I used to ask my mother, well, what about your grandmother or my father? What about, your great uncle?
And Kurt Vonnegut Jr., author of Slaughterhouse-Five and a dozen other memorable novels.
It is the past, not the future, which scares the heck out of me.
Memories, storytelling, and history. Today on A Biography of America. One of the great works of modern history is Shelby Foote's three-volume history of the Civil War. Now, Shelby's a novelist, and he feels he's got to explain that a little bit. And so in an afterword, he writes this: "The point I would like to make is that the novelist and the historian are seeking the same thing. Truth. Not a different truth, the same truth. Only they reach it or try to reach it by different routes. Whether the event took place in a world now gone to dust or in the imagination, they both want to tell us how it was, to recreate it by their separate methods, and make it live again in the world around us." Now, Arthur, you wrote a novel that is amazingly detailed about a geisha girl. You remind me so much of an historian at work. You put the details together into historical patterns and generalizations. You're trying to enter into the culture. You're using history, but you're writing fiction. You're performing a kind of high-wire act there, though, aren't you? You're a white American male writing about a completely different culture and trying to get inside that culture.
Well, the way I finally gave myself permission was by saying, I'm not trying to write about every Japanese woman. I'm not trying to write about what happened to a particular living person. I'm trying to write about what might have happened. And people do different kinds of things. There are all sorts of possibilities. It was a character with a very, very different background and sensibility from mine, of course. And I came to think of writing as being like a war, really like a war. And what I mean is that there were times when you're the general looking down on the battlefield. Yeah. And that is to say that you're making big decisions about large issues like who's going to be in the book, where's it going to go. Then there are these sort of tactical moments where you're the troop commander trying to take a hill. Mm-hmm. But then there are those moments where you are the guy in the trenches with the rifle. And those are the moments when something affects your character and you have to say how it feels. And, it really is a matter of just sitting there, closing your eyes, I think, and experiencing it. And that's the thing that I think fiction can do so powerfully.
Well, I think that the key is that as a writer you have to have tremendous empathy. You have to project yourself into the circumstances and the world of your character. But, an issue came up early in our conversation that you raised that I thought was kind of interesting, because you're doing this outside of your culture into another, projecting yourself into another culture. The idea that comes up is, can you write outside of your race? You know what I'm saying? For the Africans in America stories, I had the chance. I could write about Frederick Douglass, but I could also write about Martha Washington in first person. I actually don't think it's a problem. I think that with great empathy and imagination and taking, this is what art does anyway. It takes us from over here and puts us behind his eyes,
Yeah.
or behind her eyes. So we get to see the world from a different angle, with a different meaning, a different perspective, and finally a different truth. A truth of the world, not the truth.
And yet we're all wedded to our own perspectives. And as Charles says, the issue for art is, can you bring in a different perspective?
It's always the fact that what you're going to have is provisional and tentative. It is not going to be absolute, whether it's history or it's art.
A truth of the world, not the truth.
It isn't just a bunch of data and statistics. It's real people.
Esmeralda, you said that you felt compelled to write your own story.
Yeah, I did, because I felt like I was doing a lot of work by being in the United States. I had to learn English. I had to learn how to live in a city. I had to learn how to be in American culture. And yet I didn't exist in its literature. And I was a big reader, and I read a lot of books, and I wasn't there. And there was this sense I had that if I didn't exist in the literature, I didn't exist in the society. And when I speak about I'm talking about myself and my 10 sisters and brothers and my mother and my children and my nieces and nephews. And this sense of this invisibility is really what drove me to begin to write about my experience, because I thought it was really important for people to know that this happens in the United States. People come from other countries. People live the way we live. They struggle with these kinds of issues. And it isn't just a bunch of data and statistics. It's real people. And I wanted to become real to the rest of the United States. And that sense of not existing was what drove me through
Charles is talking about.
Or if you do exist, you exist as a caricature or a stereotype or something produced by the plantation school, you know, at the end of the 19th century, early 20th. You don't see the full diversity and range of a people and their lives. Because again, you know, you talk about writing about a group, but of course the group has many kinds of individuals in it, you know? And so you want that same range as well as depth of portrayals. And that's one of the reasons I think novelists do in fact turn to history, because it's all there. It just hasn't been brought forward to center stage yet. You know, I find myself drifting to history repeatedly.
To know yourself?
To know myself, and also it isn't a personal task. This is like a covenant that I have with my ancestors. It's a covenant that I have with my children. And it's a transmission of culture and understanding and the lives of people who shaped this nation from 1619. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's a duty in many, many ways, but it isn't an onerous duty. It's a duty that I love.
It's all here. It just hasn't been brought forward.
one person's story that's bigger than you ever imagined. I'd like to go back to something that you said earlier when you were, what gave you permission to approach this, or what gave you the courage to approach it, is this sense that this was one person's story, and that then within that person you could then go into that life and they make mistakes and whatever. And one of the things that it really sparked something in me, because that's what allowed me to write memoir, is I remember just being terrified at the prospect that I had to write about my life. And that, in fact, because there weren't a lot of books about Puerto Ricans coming to the United States and all the kinds of experiences that I had, that I knew on some level that it would be seen as representative of a whole group of people, when in fact my experience was very particular. But I do remember sitting in front of my computer one day and just saying, you know, I just have to write my story and trust that the reader is going to see that it's one person's story. And the interesting thing is that when you do that, you do put it in a historical context, because you have to, in order to be specific about your character or about yourself as a protagonist. You have to get into the real nitty-gritty specificity of that moment or of that life. And that's what brings it and makes it universal. Then it doesn't seem as daunting, but in fact it's a lot bigger than you ever imagined.
And the way you tell the story, you tell it front to back. Is there any reason for that?
I think that's the way I think. I live chronologically, so.
Yeah.
You know, can I make a comment about this issue of chronology? Because I've thought about it quite a lot as a novelist. It's terrifically important in storytelling, because if you imagine a situation like, for example, you're at a dinner party and the host looks across the table at you a moment longer than he should, and you're a man, you know. It doesn't mean anything. But if you put a story behind it, you're having an affair with his wife. Now suddenly it's a bone-chilling event when he looks at you too long like that.
Right.
But if you start a story with that and then flash back to the beginning of the affair and work your way up through the dinner party, it's a very different story from starting with the beginning of the affair and working your way through in its natural chronological order, because in the first case, you pose a question in the reader's mind: what was that look all about? Why did it upset him so much? And now the story is really principally there to answer a question. It's a sort of intellectual satisfaction. But if you do it in its proper order, when you get to that scene, now it has an emotional effect upon the reader. And I think chronology is intrinsically more emotional or emotion-laden.
I'd agree. But a lot of history's gotten away from the art of storytelling. We forgot Herodotus, we forgot Thucydides, we forgot what made history compelling, and we're back to, you know, analysis, you know, without story. But I think the idea of a storyteller has a more interesting legacy and heritage. I'd rather pin up with Homer, you know, than Charles Beard. Yeah.
That sounds like an easy one.
Yeah, it is. But the storytelling technique, I deal with a scene in a book I'm writing now in Vicksburg where Grant goes behind the lines, the Confederate lines in Mississippi. He cuts off communication with Washington, and he wins. But again, in a history book, they'd say, well, Grant, it was a fantastic campaign. He cut behind the lines and he won. But what you don't see, there was another army in Mississippi at the time that could have ambushed him. You don't sense the danger of Grant going behind there unless you put those options out there that all these things could have happened to him. And that's storytelling, you know?
All these things could have happened.
The grit and the mud and the dust of human experience and existence.
When you write, no matter how much you give yourself permission by saying it is just an individual, it does often happen that readers read it and think there's some larger meaning, which is all right, but it doesn't have to be what you meant.
You know, when people come to me and say, you know, I've discovered this, or I found that, or did you mean this, you know, I have to remind them I'm really not that smart to put that kind of very abstract thematic thing in there. It's just not something that I sit down and say, I'm going to put something in here so that you can write a doctoral dissertation. Very few writers will do that. You
I do that, though.
You do?
I do that, yes.
How do you start?
Well, I mean, my work is philosophical fiction, largely.
Right.
So there is going to be usually some kind of universal theme. But, you know, the whole point is to put flesh and blood on it. I mean, abstract ideas don't begin floating up here in the ether or Plato's realm of forms. They begin down in the grit and the mud and the dust of human experience and existence.
But
it's
do you
always
go
there.
and try, and are you very specific about putting these things in there?
Well, what it is they emerge. They emerge from tracing the drama, because there's no way, I think, that you can separate them. You know, very fundamental questions such as, who am I? You know, questions of identity. Even further questions like we're talking about right here, like, what can I know? Questions of epistemology. What is knowledge? How do we define that? You know what I'm saying? Those are questions that can be dramatized, and indeed are in fiction all the time. I mean, I personally think that fiction and history are sister disciplines. So, you know, it's not like putting things in one box, and that's a novel. Putting things in one box, that's history. No.
But to speak to your sort of approach to fiction, if it's true that a novel can be about one of four things: an idea, a story, a character, or a world, a setting.
I think
at a certain point they merge, and it ends up being about all four of them.
Yeah, I think every good novel has to be all four.
And I think it's a question. You start in one. You start with one. It sounds like you start with idea. A lot of people start with character, but in the end you get to the same place.
And it depends on the story. I mean, we don't write every novel and story the same way. Some story you start with an idea, some story you start with a character, some story you start with a question. But whatever the case is, I think that for the novelist, and I would certainly hope this is also true for the historian, what dominates this whole process is that it's a process of discovery. You don't go into, I believe, a historical work with your mind made up. If you are, you're a bad historian. But it's like a scientist who goes in with a hypothesis, and the end of the process in the lab may contradict your hypothesis, right? Same thing with a novelist.
But if you have
it should be a process of discovery as we go along.
Don, in writing your History of Chicago, I'm curious what brought you to the subject, and if you were surprised by what you learned along the way.
Well, I was surprised by the fact that I picked the book. I was going to write a novel based in Florence on the Lippi brothers, the painters. I had the novel all mapped out. And I came back and was walking around Chicago, and I don't want to say I had an urban epiphany, but I was standing on the Michigan Avenue Bridge and just sensing the sunny day, the rivers flowing, the skyscrapers in the background, the lake behind me, and I just sensed the power of that city, the incredible power, and the fact that how did this thing come to be? It's only 180-some years old, and it just grew up like a mushroom out of that prairie mud, and wouldn't that be a great story to tell? And I came at it, too, with a sense of humility about my own discipline, because I have these real doubts about history. I often call it a crippled discipline because it can't get at this elusive thing we call truth in its completeness. Records are lost, libraries burn down, people forget, people lie in their memoirs. How do you get at this stuff, you know? How do you get at the truth?
Why is truth so important?
That's the point. Why is it?
I don't know. I don't know why we have this desire and this need to constantly look for the truth.
I think as a historian, I'm looking for understanding as much as truth.
I think that's where truth ties in, is that it's not so much that you want truth as that truth is a stepping stone to reach an understanding.
Yeah.
I just have to interject this, too. There's another reason about the truth that's so terribly important. If you've had negative histories written of a people over 100 years, I'm thinking of Black Americans again, their contributions to this republic on every possible level, political, economic, and cultural, having the truth that brings forth those contributions is extraordinarily important.
Yeah. Not
just for the sake of building up egos with young children, but for the sake of having a more accurate record of this country's evolution and history.
Well, that's what gets me angry. When historians talk about truth, oftentimes what they're saying is what's important is true, okay? And it just so happened that what you're talking about right now to historians 50 years ago was not so-called important.
No.
But it's damn important to you right now.
Well, it's not just damn important to me, it's damn important to anybody in a multiracial, multicultural country.
Yeah.
So that we don't basically just have the history of those who won the wars, okay? Whether they were the wars against the Indians or whether they were the wars against the slaves.
Truth is a stepping stone to understanding.
Every history is an interpretation.
It takes a very, very long time for a human being to start from nothing at birth and put together a framework on which to hang things in your mind, and complicated enough understanding of the world and of himself and his place in it, that things begin to mean something.
You have the capacity for memory.
Well, this issue of framework is terrifically important, I think, because there's something that I call, I named it after myself. Nobody had ever named it, so I named it Golden's phenomenon. And it is that thing that happens when you've never heard of something, and then you hear of it, and you hear of it about 6 times over the course of the next 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Well, actually, what happens is it's been out there all along.
Right.
But you never were aware of it. You become aware of it, and now it gets stuck in the screen. It doesn't pass through any longer. I think that is such an important issue. And
so we start to become these memory-haunted beings, but a lot of times, as you've once said to me, you want to forget. You almost have to forget.
I think for oppressed people, history is a burden. You don't. There's a part of you that just doesn't want to know because, as you pointed out, it's been negative all along, for example, or it's been ignored, or it gets in your way in one way or the other. And when I was writing my novel, I had the sense of America Gonzalez dragging her history behind her, and it is such a burden that it's hard for her to move at the speed at which she would like to move because it's there. And the thing is that if you have the history but you don't know what to do with it, that's when it really weighs you down.
You have to understand that, how you got here. But it doesn't mean that you are entrapped by history, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Because, again, every history is an interpretation. So, I mean, really, history is liberating rather than entrapping. You know
and also, every history, I think, what history shows is that we're all of us constantly in a process of invention and reinvention. And so in the collective is the country.
I think we are very mutable. I think we are about becoming rather than being. We are about, we are verbs and not nouns.
But I think that as you're changing, you're always lagging. Your sense of yourself lags behind the reality.
Your character in the book, I remember that one really tremendous scene where she looks in the mirror and she's in the process of moving from what she had been, living in a small seacoast town, a simple fishing village, to being a geisha. And she's about there and she looks in the mirror and she can't even find and see her former self. That's how far she's gone. That morning she wakes up and she's not quite sure who she is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because she's in transition.
And I think that
countries do this too, I think. Maybe at the end of the 20th century we don't quite know where we are because so many huge changes are taking place and we know we're supposed to know about them and where they're headed, but we're not quite sure.
If you change cultures, you constantly feel like that's happening because you're constantly negotiating those two aspects of yourself, the one that you are and the one that you're becoming.
But human beings do change because we're able to transmit culture. And the culture accretes, it changes over time. And that's the only thing that keeps us from being what we would call animals.
Yeah. I'll raise that question with that very question I write with my students. I mean, what separates you from your dog? Because your dog has a kind of memory, reflective memory, put him near the fire, it pulls away, come spot, things like that. But
there's no transmitted memory.
Transmitted memory. And because we're hooked into our memory, as you pointed out earlier, we're haunted by it, or liberated. We're burdened, liberated, or haunted. Yeah. And we're these dream-haunted creatures.
It's been true from the beginning of time, man's need to tell stories. From the cave paintings at Lascaux to the graffiti on the Berlin Wall, the stories we write and tell have contained our fears, expressed our joys, and given shape to our uncertainties. Whether we are talking about the African griot, the medieval bard, the contemporary novelist, or the historian, their stories define who we are as individuals and as a people. In his masterpiece, Invisible Man, the late great novelist Ralph Ellison speaks of a character who falls out of history. At first, a reader doubts that this is possible, because doesn't history encompass everything? What Ellison wants us to think about is something every historian and storyteller knows, namely that history is only the events that have been seen and recorded. And that means most of life remains invisible to us most of the time. So if one falls out of recorded history, one falls into not only the realms of imagination and the possible, but also into a universe of lives and events long hidden by official interpretations of what has been. One job of the storyteller in our time is to make the invisible visible, to put marginalized lives at center stage, and remind us again and again that all our knowledge is provisional, tentative, and always in need of revision.
It is the past, not the future, which scares the heck out of me. Military and political and financial histories of this century alone, never mind all the other numbered nightmares, can only persuade a sane and decent person of the following. Human beings are much too vile for a planet as salubrious and enchanting as this one has been for millions and millions of years now. We do not deserve to live here. Histories of our humane imagination, of our fine arts, and especially of our music, I would have to say, can make us seem like angels. Angels, to be sure, with tears in their eyes. Our artists have again and again done what so many mothers have asked their gifted children, or even their ordinary children, to do if they can. Make this a better world than it was before you got here. My synonym for the fine arts again would surely include our wisest histories of every sort. Humane imagination. our Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights of our Constitution and Abraham Lincoln's address on the battlefield at Gettysburg are literature. So is the speech Martin Luther King Jr. made in 1963, in my time, in our time, which begins this way. I have a dream that one day, music maestro, please. God bless us all.
For information about a Biography of America, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org. Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPD to advance excellent teaching.